Welcome to the Bully Pulpit. I'm your host, Matt Stalford, and today we'll be discussing student loans, a topic that hits close to home for college students everywhere. We want to help everyone get a better understanding of the basics of how they work, their advantages and disadvantages, and the political context in which they're being discussed across the country today. So to begin, everyone knows the basics about student loans. They're money borrowed to help pay for some kind of education, but there are so many nuances once we get past that starting point. And this issue can get complicated fast, so it's a difficult topic to productively discuss and address. You probably already know that higher education is more expensive than ever before. Now, there are so many reasons for the sharp increase in tuition costs over the last few decades, but at the end of the day, it's more expensive to go to school than it used to be, and a lot of people have trouble affording it. At the same time, the ability to finance an education over the long term is more important than ever, especially when you consider increasing demand for college degrees in the workforce. So in its most basic form, a student loan is money borrowed to finance an education, which includes living expenses, tuition, and all the little things that go along with it, like textbooks and lab fees. Now let's get into the three categories that divide student loans. The first is public versus private. Public loans are given out by the government, either the state or federal, and are typically offered to people who have some kind of financial need. That doesn't mean they're only for people who can't afford a college education at all, but they're typically reserved for people who couldn't pay for one outright. Private loans, however, are generally available to anyone who applies for one, so long as they can get someone to sign for them or can demonstrate a good credit history. Though their availability is nice, there is a downside to them, in that they often have higher interest rates than public loans because they aren't subsidized by the government. Now the next category of loan is merit versus need-based. Need-based loans are exactly what they sound like, loans written out to people who can demonstrate some type of financial need. These are often public, often come at a lower interest rate than other loans, and are most commonly awarded by federal government programs like FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. Merit loans, however, serve a different purpose. These are typically given out by colleges and universities to students who they consider high performers, people who the university feels would benefit the institution by attending. An example would be a loan that's only accessible to applicants who received an SAT or ACT score over a certain threshold. Both merit and need-based loans can be public or private, though need-based are much more commonly public than otherwise. Now the last category of loans is subsidized versus unsubsidized, which is about the amount the government, either state or federal, pays to reduce the interest rate of loans. Unsubsidized loans are the most common type of loan, and private loans are almost universally unsubsidized. Like need-based loans, these are exactly what they sound like, loans that reflect the market value of a student loan unchanged by government subsidies. Subsidized loans, on the other hand, are loans that the government helps cover the cost of, and often go hand in hand with need-based loans. And though they are not universally public, most private loans are not subsidized by the government and tend to reflect the full market cost. Now, one of the biggest problems people face in student loan debt is that it is very difficult to get out of compared to other forms of debt. Like all types of debt, people can incur penalties if they're unable to pay them back. But unlike other types of debt, student loans are non-dischargeable. When a loan is non-dischargeable, that means the debt one still is left to pay cannot be restructured if the borrower declares bankruptcy. This is because, unlike a mortgage taken out for a home, there is no collateral that can be collected if the debtor fails to meet their obligations. Put simply, you can repossess a house, but you can't repossess an education. This is one of the main reasons the student loan crisis in this country is truly a crisis. If you're one of the 22% of student loan borrowers who defaults on their payments, there simply isn't a good avenue for you to fix your situation. And on top of this fundamental challenge, other factors like predatory interest rates offered by private companies or reductions in federal borrower protection regulations can make student debt very difficult to deal with very fast. With all of these factors in place, especially the record-high tuition levels, the student debt problem has become a full-blown crisis over the past few decades. The Brookings Institution claims that 1 in 10 student borrowers are more than 90 days overdue on their loan payments, giving student loans the highest delinquency rate of all types of household debt. Furthermore, default rates are skyrocketing. 40% of borrowers are expected to default by 2023. The statistics are grim. But Brookings argues that these problems are not just due to increasing tuition levels. The think tank instead says that the crisis is caused by a shift in what kinds of students are going to school and why. The first important shift is that more people feel pressure to go to college. Part of this trend is that more jobs require college degrees than ever before. But another part is that there is a stronger societal pressure to get a college education as opposed to going to trade school or entering the workforce straight out of high school. There's also an increase in demand for graduate degrees. So with the overall increase in degree expectations, more people are borrowing more money to pay for it. But the second, and perhaps more important shift that Brookings notes, is that people are going to more expensive private schools or to for-profit universities, often without a good plan to repay the debt that they're incurring to do so. Pursuing a low-paying major and attending an expensive school is an increasingly popular decision for many students, who all too often end up with debt they simply can't repay by working in their chosen field. However, these shifts are not evenly distributed among demographic groups. Brookings claims that the total debt level is often not the main problem, arguing that instead, socioeconomic disparities are often the best indicators for whether or not a borrower will default on their debt. They note that although average debt levels per student have increased over time, people with certain personal and institutional factors, like being a student of color, attending a for-profit school, or dropping out of school at any point, are much better predictors of defaulting. In fact, borrowers with those qualities are more likely to default even at low debt levels, and Brookings states that defaults are highest among those who borrow relatively small amounts. One of the most popular proposals among progressive groups is Bernie Sanders' plan to make tuition free at public colleges and universities, while allowing current lenders to refinance their loans at today's interest rates without losing access to federal repayment programs. Some states, such as New Jersey and Tennessee, have implemented free community college programs, reasoning that this helps students from working-class backgrounds gain an education. However, the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, says that this proposal would increase non-completion of college, citing lower completion rates at open admissions programs today. Cato sees the root of the student debt problem as universities' desire to constantly expand their programs, and therefore their tuition. In their view, because loans are enabling the colleges to constantly raise prices, we should gradually eliminate federal student aid, which incentivizes students to attend college even if they can't afford it in their present situation. They argue that while federal aid successfully convinces working-class students to begin college, it doesn't help them graduate, leaving them in a worse position than they would have been otherwise. Opposition to this proposal rests on the idea that while the government shouldn't be profiting off of student loans, it should assume some of the risk from the students. Other proposals include the Roosevelt Institute's plan to have the federal government pay or forgive all current student loans, which would cost about $1.4 trillion. In response to the argument that doing this would be inequitable, the Institute says that loans' increased impact on vulnerable people makes keeping them in place more inequitable than removing them would be. On the other side of the aisle, the American Conservative proposes a plan which would remove the cap on interest rates for student loans, reasoning that this leaves open the possibility of getting a student loan while lowering incentives for people who can't pay for them. While this plan acknowledges that it would reduce the spread of educational opportunities, it sees the winnowing of ineffective colleges as a good thing, which directs students to places which will get them better jobs. These proposals, while they don't cover all of the ideas presented, should give you an idea of what kind of plans exist to address the problem of student debt. But although there are many suggested solutions, it's important to note that there isn't much political will to act on this issue right now. Though elected officials like Bernie Sanders campaigned on this issue in 2016, few politicians have actually gone so far as to propose legislation which would address the issue. Right now, there is no legislation on the floor which seeks to solve this problem. On top of that, Betsy DeVos and the Department of Education are currently being sued for failing to forgive certain student loans the government had previously promised to forgive. These circumstances mean that it's all the more important for you to express your concerns to your elected representatives. Our democratic system only works when people speak their mind. So if this issue affects you, make sure your opinion is heard. So thank you all for tuning in. This concludes our episode of The Bully Pulpit, and we'll see you next year.